Here we go. It is Wednesday. Precious is back.
Yay!
All these poor
Missed you
people had to
guys.
deal with just me last week. and the actual I guess insult to injury was it was back to back because Heather was traveling too. So a lot of people got just me for 2 episodes in a row. So
That's fantastic.
well, hopefully you are doing better and everything is squared away.
Yes, thank you.
I
am.
That's good. That's good. So, anyone who is unfamiliar with this program, this is Sell Like a CPCU. We are put on by the Agents and Brokers Interest Group, part of the CPCU Society. As usual, like, comment, subscribe, share, hit the notification bell, retweet. If you are watching this on Facebook or Twitter, please pop over to YouTube and give us a subscribe because it helps with the search algorithm and helps rank us up when people are looking for insurance and salesy type things and all the good stuff. So
Yes.
definitely help us out there. So, something that sometimes I forget to do and then sometimes I don't is put the scroll up so that people know where the actual addresses are on the bottom of the screen. So if you are looking for places to follow us, that is where you can find them. So,
And what episode is this for us?
Hold on. Now you're putting me on blast again because I counted it last time.
Yes.
I counted it last time, and then I'm slacking here. So hold
Should be
on.
plus one.
I will tell you momentarily. 1 second here. Don't mind me. This should be number 25. 25.
Sweet.
So we're almost at on a weekly basis. We're almost at 6 full months of content, which is pretty cool.
Wow.
So, but yeah, so number 25, magical, I guess, silver, 25 to silver.
I was about to say, I feel like I owe you like an anniversary gift of some kind.
At least some candy or something with like silver wrapping or something, you know?
Absolutely.
So the world is changing. I mean, change is constant, but the world is changing yet again on us. And I think the question is, are we going back to what the world looked like before, or is this going to be some kind of, again, something different here for the future? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would assume that you're going to say that it's not going back pretty much ever to the way it was pre-COVID, and that we'll have some kind of, different setup here into the future. Is that kind of accurate?
I don't think there is a going back. I think, this is kind of one of those pivotal moments that we'll see what the new normal looks like moving forward. But there's certain things now, lessons learned, good, bad, and indifferent, that we have to acknowledge and we have to apply, moving forward. I think that, we've proven that the impossible is possible under the right circumstances. There are organizations that were hell-bent against any sort of remote, but when faced between remote or out of business, remote wasn't so bad.
Yeah. You're saying that, you can say that again.
When we recognized how all of those exclusions applied to business interruption, it was like, oh, yeah, guess what? We're going back to we're going to work remotely, and so now, lifestyles have changed, according to this. It's interesting on a personal note, I had a cold last week. I'm like, what is that? And so I'm not around people anymore. I'm like bubble girl, right? And so I don't have... So between mask wearing, I've heard that from a lot of people too, like flu season, I think they reported, incidents were way down, because we were social distancing, we're being more mindful of hand washing, and all these different things. I remember going into restaurants and again, just seeing all of the sneeze guards that have been put up. And as we've reopened and, capacity is starting to grow again, we learned that some of these best practices are just that. They're just best practices. They're not to be completely thrown out simply because there's not a mandate requiring, that you do these sort of things. But, it was funny because obviously still on the tail end of, the peak of the pandemic, anytime you sneeze or cough in public, people think that
no.
The Walking Dead.
They look at you like you're a terrorist. Like, what's he up to?
How dare they come into this establishment, Just,
And you're like,
ground
it's
zero.
allergies. It's spring. It's allergies.
My car is literally yellow from the pollen. Like, can I get a little bit of a break here?
Yes. Yeah.
But no, I think that, as companies are, now looking at how do we, it's not the far extreme, because if we look at this time last year when we were at a complete standstill,
Mm.
it was shelter in place. It wasn't even social distancing.
Yep.
The economy slowed down. Everyone on bated breath just didn't know one day to the next. The number of deaths were just horrendous. And there's so many different long-term implications that we've yet to see.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we're like, how do we, rebound? What
Yeah.
does that look like? Who comes in? Do we phase it? Do we all have to come back in?
Mm.
Now that we've established that, I remember pre-pandemic, one of the large, I think it might have been Microsoft or Yahoo or someone, had really kind of done this reverse move with having their teams remote. And they felt like there was so much more merit to being under one roof from a synergistic standpoint,
Hmm.
that they brought everyone back. And it was viewed as being really controversial because it felt like it was kind of, you know, the opposite of, the trend.
Yeah.
And then again, in one fell swoop, we all went, the other way. So I think that we're going to start to adopt some of the things that we did before, but execute on them differently.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. And we were actually just talking about kind of how the CPCU annual meeting into risk is starting to play out here. It's being held in Orlando. So obviously, that is one of the more, I guess, kind of like first adopters here of reopening, being Florida. So the venue is of that ilk. They are limiting attendance. So I think that'll probably be at least something for the intermediate term where I don't know if conventions or at least the vast majority of them will immediately go to just like, if they were used to having 10,000 people before, after. And there's some business reasons for that too, right? I mean, like a lot of employers still aren't authorizing travel
Travel.
expenses and things like that. So I think there's also a business case for those decisions. But something we were talking about before was, we were hollering for hybrid events even before COVID. And there's a multitude of reasons, one of which was the cost, right? So, from just to kind of like, resurrect and then beat the same dead horse again, in your estimation, what are the best reasons for going at the very least hybrid here now that the world is kind of like coming back together in at least a small shape and form?
So I used to be a little bit of a skeptic of hybrid events, to be completely honest with you. And
Interesting.
it was
Okay.
really based on, I guess, my experience with the company I worked for at the time.
Hmm.
So home office was Chicago, Illinois, and that's where, of course, the heart of the operation was. And I worked as a remote, employee to this office.
Hmm.
Once a quarter, I think it was, they would kind of do the town hall, everybody gather around the atrium and listen to, the updates from leadership on what happened. And so
Yeah.
the on-site employees got the real 3D experience. The rest of us would dial in. We didn't even zoom in. We would just dial in on a conference call line. And inevitably, somebody's not muted, the person's not mic'd up, there's like laughter in the room, you missed the joke, there's all these sidebar conversations, and we would always have to try to like prompt whoever's there, hey, hand them the mic, or there's feedback, or it was a subpar experience.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
very much felt like you were on the outside looking in, because we were, and so I always,
Now
kind of.
let me ask you: was that a long running thing, or was that something they had just adopted like recently?
As amateurishly as it was pulled off, you would think it was new, but it was a thing, that
Oh
was
wow.
a long going thing. And they never really accounted for, some of these, just kind of disconnects. So what would happen is that they would give kind of the State of the Union,
Hmm.
address. Afterwards, there'd be like a recap email or something that would go out. The audio was very garbled. There was no video to be seen. It was, including us that weren't in home office was an afterthought,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
so making sure that there's, how do you make the experience still as worthwhile? So I think, again, post pandemic or, since the pandemic, we've invested a little bit more into AV.
Hmm.
Yes and no, because I've still, seen and participated in stuff where, and present company included, right? Where internet bandwidth goes in and out,
Yeah.
you get choppy. I have frozen during many an episode on here. So I'm not pointing fingers as if I'm, blameless in this situation. But yeah, it's just kind of, and obviously to account for the difference, like with InterRisk, there's going to be, a different pricing structure. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, recognizing that some of the things it's going to be really hard to duplicate. I'm nervous about this because the energy, the
Hmm.
foot traffic and the feel and, our annual meeting is a big deal
Yeah.
for a CPCU. The conferment where you're standing shoulder to shoulder with your classmates, and you all say the pledge for the first time. Like all of these experiences, it's going to be a little bit weird to
Yeah.
do it and be just a little tile in a Zoom.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, there's a lot of moving parts there, right? So like my first immediate thought was, all right, so if they were doing this for a long period of time, either one, and I don't think this is the case, but either one, they just didn't get any feedback from the employees, which I think is probably completely wrong. I'm pretty sure the employees were like, look, this sucks, and they were like, well, deal with it, like we're not going to put much money into it, right? But I think the other dynamic would be that, other companies were probably the average company that did something like that probably also sucked at it too. Like there was no market impetus. Like there was probably a few companies that did it really well and were kind of like inclusive and thoughtful about that. And then there were a bunch of other companies that were like, oh yeah, we do a hybrid event too. And it's like, no, you really don't. You have the phone running. It's like being like at Christmas, right? Like, and having the person passed around the room on the phone, and you'd be like, "Oh, it was almost like they were there." No, no, it wasn't. Not like it was not like they were there. But so to that point, you said yourself, like we've had companies that have invested more in technology. They've just gotten the skills to improve the quality of that. The question becomes whether or not they actually deploy them. I mean, like, I really hope that they've, learned from this situation and they end up deploying it. And so, yeah, I think there are ways to do it. If you're like, it's one of those things like if you're going to do it, you have to commit to it. If you're not
Absolutely.
committed to it, it's going to come out like even worse than if you didn't do it in the first place. It's always like you watch. Do you watch some of the competition baking shows and stuff like that on Netflix?
Yes.
Right? Like one of the things that's make or break for a lot of the competitors is they have like a nice piece and then they have one extra thing that they have it in their mind they want to include, but it's like it's done really poorly, like substandard quality. And the judges are always like, well, why did you serve that to us? Like, why did you include that, right? And they were like, well, I felt it would be
Was
cool. And
there, yeah.
they were like it took away from things, right?
Hmm.
So I think that's the answer is if you're gonna do it, do it. Like, don't just make it like the people that are hybrid attendees are the third wheel on a
A
date, right?
burden.
Like, yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, you need to include them. Wow, I could go down a really bad road with that, and I'm not going to. But make sure to include them in the experience, right? Include them and like bend over backwards to make sure that the people in person are also getting an opportunity to interact with the people that are there virtual because that will, again, bridge that gap a little bit better. All right, our favorite, well, our Matt 1A, 1B, whatever, I don't know. Matt Maxwell is watching and listening, which is fantastic. All right, so how does this apply to sales? How will sales, in your estimation, kind of evolve over the next couple of years once we come out of what has basically been a fully digital remote sales world now for about a year and a half?
So if I had to kind of again estimate and make some some assumptions and some projections here, I think what we're going to start to see is that there's going to be some meeting bias. There are going to be those who, for a myriad of reasons, whether it's cost, health, or the preference, the convenience, that are still going to prefer to do business and engage in an online manner. Obviously, when you have folks that are meeting on a regular basis that are located in different geographic areas, it's not feasible to come together every time. You have to have a meeting or an update on something, so that will still happen. But you are going to have people who are still going to crave that human interaction, that if it's possible. And so in the sales world, when you're trying to build rapport and show goodwill and make yourself as personable as possible, if you have the option of getting coffee and things like that, some of that is going to return. So people are going to, what I've heard and what I experienced personally is, initially when everyone was, transitioning to remote, there wasn't a whole lot of precedent in terms of etiquette, right? So there were some groups that I would, you get on, you're like, are we cameras on? Are we cameras off? Is everyone muted? Is it rude to mute? I actually read an article that kind of broke down some of these, etiquette things. Me personally, especially with kids and pets and traffic and who knows what else, my standard default mode is on mute unless I'm speaking. Right. And so I think they were saying, like, if there's more than maybe 5 participants in a call, then it's, courtesy to mute unless you're saying something. But then there are other times when it's a small meeting and muting yourself comes across as being impersonal. Right. And so the expectation is it's supposed to be like real life, because in real life, I wouldn't just remain muted. I'd be ready to jump in and interject or whatever. So, as we kind of get past some of these biases, because today I can be on this, I can hit end meeting, and then boom, I can hop and I'll be, across the country, in the matter of just a couple of clicks. And so trying to really gauge what is the comfort level and what is the preference, and can I accommodate their need or desire? Because here's what it boils down to. If you are in person, let's grab a cup of coffee person, and my competitor wants to go get coffee and I send you a Zoom link. Did I just lose that deal?
Something that I was also thinking about, and Tony in the house. Awesome, Tony. Hello. So something that I was also thinking about was to that effect, right? Some clients will still prize that personal relationship, and to them that personal relationship has more to do with than your name or a video conference call or something like that. It has to be, them looking you in the eyes and shaking your hand or whatever, right? Like they prize that kind of ability to kind of look you over, right, and determine your body language and things like that. So some people are used to a team sales approach, or at least a team service and sales approach, where you might have an annual meeting with a client and go over, the year in review. You might have that initial pitch meeting where it's you, but then it's also, the person who's going to take care of the most immediate service issues. It's going to be your claims or loss control person that's an expert that comes in, right? Depending on the size of the organization that you're working with. And so those group pitches might look more hybrid now than in the past, where the expense of time as well as money to send, the loss control claims person on the call probably might get pulled back, and it'll be, the person who has the account relationship who is face forward in person, and then you'll have other people remoting in, which will also be interesting because it could entirely be, depending on the size of the client, it could also be the decision maker in front of you and their team remote coming into that meeting as well. So it's going to be interesting. There's going to be kind of like this give and take. I think also the one thing that I would advise, and you could tell me whether I'm off base on this, as an employer or as an organization, specifically a sales organization, do not think that you can just go all the way back to the way that it was, right? Because especially depending on certain industries are going to be kind of a little bit more reticent to get back to, something close to what, things were like pre-pandemic and in person, everything like that. And then the other thing is if you've had success doing things purely remotely
Hmm.
after in the past doing things more kind of like hybrid and things like that, do not think that you can just keep doing everything remotely without, testing that hypothesis. Because if you're going to just be like, well, you know what, we saved a crap ton of money by not sending anyone anywhere. To your point, if there's someone who's willing to go out and get a cup of coffee and your client or prospect is that person, you just saved yourself the sale is basically what you saved yourself, But what's your opinion on that? Do you think there's a chance that some companies will overshoot the mark on those things?
Well, I know that one of the one of the agencies that I worked with, a couple years ago, we had a in-person office, but the in-person office was leveraged almost like an incubator. Okay.
Hmm.
So that is where a couple of the really tenured people were, because when you were brought on, you worked in that environment. And basically after about a year, that was the time frame. If you, kind of proved to be, self-sufficient, you were given the option of going to work from home,
Hmm.
because you'd free up that seat, excuse me, for the next round of people that were coming in the door.
Yeah.
They did that for a while, and then there was, we had moved into a larger office space where we weren't, constrained with square footage, and
Hmm.
they reversed the decision, and all of a sudden it was, if you were within a 60-mile radius of the office, you were expected to come in, because
Yeah.
they had made that significant, investment into the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Someone's going to come sit in these seats.
Yeah.
And that, was very jarring to some. I mean, when you think about everything from, work-life balance, working from home might mean that you can reduce to a one-car household. It might mean that you don't have the need for after-school care,
Yeah.
if you've got children who are old enough. And so, we have to just be mindful that our human capital, they're not like other assets where you can just flip switches.
Hmm.
That these are things that oftentimes need to be phased in, and every situation is different. You may have some where going into the office was the highlight of their day.
Yeah.
you know Working at home maybe proved a burden, and now they're excited to be able to be in a dedicated space, where they can focus, and they're not expected to be available for domestic tasks, right?
Mm.
And then you may have, again, the reverse. And so I think it's a highly individualized decision, and I
Hmm.
think it needs to be approached with some degree of sensitivity, that you're not going to please everyone, chances are.
Yeah.
But it's going to be very hard to make the case, if you have actually improved since going remote,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
why we're coming back in office. Like, what is the benefit in doing so?
Yes. Yeah. 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 And I agree. I think there was a certain group of people who were resistant to change at the beginning of everything, and then here now there will still be people that are resistant to change,
Hmm.
and it could be the same group of people, it could be a completely different group of people, right? And so that's part of that difficulty or that dynamic where the people who originally were more than okay staying home. Now, some of them may be reticent to come back and they still want to stay remote. And then others are like, man, I can't wait to get back into the office and make a pot of coffee and visit someone at their cubicle, right? And so to that effect, I think there's also going to be some dramatic changes in terms of clients and prospects and what you're having to help them with, right?
Hmm.
So a big decision that I think some companies and some prospects might have used COVID and the pandemic as the impetus to pull the trigger on certain property sales or reorganizations and things like that. I think there are even more of them that, as a result of the pandemic, have gone back and begun to reevaluate their facilities, plant, process, their locations, as well as the IT infrastructure and things like that. And so, there's some opportunity there, and then there's also some need. If it's your current clients, they're going to be looking at, divesting property, adding property. There could be some very expansive renovations that are happening. I've heard of a number of companies that are, whereas their main office area used to be, the vast majority of it be offices, I think they're more inclined to change part of that area now to more of kind of like a recreational health, or kind of like community space almost, and less office space, understanding that people won't be in the office full time anymore,
Hmm.
but they do want to offer them some additional value as an employee to, keep them involved and keep them, interacting, even if they are allowing them to kind of like remote in and out. Builder's risk is going to be, I think it's still going to be a big deal going forward, right?
The construction scene is interesting. Obviously, the impacts of the pandemic after the fact. We've seen shortages now in lumber, and you can kind of pair that with the pandemic, and then you add on top of that a hyperactive storm season,
Hmm.
that we've had. And so you see right now it is, I think they said the average single family home, the cost of the build is almost up 30K.
Yeah.
From what it was because of some of those shortages, and
Yep.
so you have, like you said, some of these, what I've seen even here locally in like the Dallas, Texas area is, facilities that may have been exclusively office space that are going mixed use now,
Mm.
because they just don't have the need for, the tenant that has the 50,000 square feet because they've got an entire floor, reserved off. And
Yep.
so if they're, can modify that to lofts or flats, or, again, bring in some habitational where they didn't have had before. And
Mhm.
then, you have the amenities, right? Because that was a big thing here in the Dallas area for years, is it wasn't enough just to have, the aesthetics of a beautiful office, but,
Yep.
does food deliver? Do you have on-site gym? Do you have an on-site, whatever the case is, vending? We got to get
Mhm.
away from just Cokes and chips, giving different options, and really that focus on wellness.
Yeah.
I think, making sure that we understood that wellness was more than just physical, right?
Mm.
That, offering things like maybe flex time, a hybrid schedule,
Yeah.
is it really necessary to do 5 8-hour days? Can that be done in 4 10s? Or, that whole I still remember being, in a big, underwriting service center.
Mhm.
And it was funny because the cubicle walls weren't very tall, and we were all on the same shift at the time.
Yeah.
And so it was almost like watching prairie dogs pop up. You knew when 5 o'clock was coming because everyone, boop, 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 it's like popcorn. Everyone's like on their feet, purses are on shoulders, and you're literally just jiggling the mouse because you have to wait until 5 strikes on the dot before you log in. Nothing is getting done. Nothing is getting done. It's just going through the motions.
Yeah.
And it was funny because it almost felt like very Flintstone like, right? It's like yabba dabba do, and everyone just kind of hit the door. And
Yep.
I would just kind of fall back because I knew the parking lot was going to be chaos.
Oh
Right.
yeah. Yeah. No, you'd get caught in traffic leaving the office, right? And
So
that's
I'm
all
like,
it was.
let me go wash my coffee mug and do
Yeah.
some things. I'll let them hash it out, and then I'll leave out in about another 10 15. But I think about some of those dynamics, and I think about how working from home, I'm less concerned with working a little bit over because there's no traffic implications.
Yeah.
Right. And so if I have something that's pressing, I can choose. And again, in the agency environment where we're very task driven versus, it's about results, right? It's about
Mhm.
selling. So nobody cares if I worked exactly 7 hours and 53 minutes today.
Yep.
If I needed to log off a little early, because chances are I'm going to hop on a little early because I don't have a commute, you
Hmm.
know? So we've got to have some flexibility, and we've got to be able to, evaluate it on a case by case basis, and, move away from just doing what we've done prior to just because we're able to again.
Yeah. And so Tony and Lainey both came up with almost, they must be like mentally like sharing brainwaves or something, because I think they both came up with something extremely similar in terms of feedback. And this is also really good, an opportunity, sales opportunity here too. So Tony said Jacobson surveyed all the in-office people on how / if they want to come back, and then made decisions based on that survey. The options were as little as a couple of times a month. So that was good, eliciting feedback from the workforce. And then we're doing, Lainey said, we're doing surveys to gather info on what our employees want, even individually, to allow, what is needed. And so to that point, I think that's fantastic with the workforce where you're at. And I think it's also an opportunity. Look, a lot of sales is finding reasons to have sales interactions and conversations, right? And so this is a perfect opportunity to have a conversation with your current clients as well as prospects. Survey them, ask them, what are they doing, right? Like you're going to ask them what are they doing in terms of you being able to kind of help, provide solutions and service opportunities, but also you're gathering research yourself, right? Like what does the market environment look like in terms of your book and your ideal prospects, and what's going to work into the future? Are you going to have to go back to a lot of in person, or is it just going to be one of those things where you have to have a little bit of in person, but really just it's still going to be a lot of virtual? So I think those are really good points of view. What are your thoughts on that? I come up with all kinds of crazy reasons to have a sales conversation. So like
Well,
that's like 90% of the job.
I was thinking about, because when you talk about sales and again, the different layer, sales that you're in. And for
Yeah.
anyone who's ever spent any time in a brick and mortar agency, and you're familiar with like a territory manager who showed up with donuts, right? Or they have swag and they have pens, they have koozies, they'll do a lunch and learn where they'll bring in, Jason's Deli or something, while you sit through the presentation, over and over again. This particular carrier that does a lot of business here in the South, where they were known for having whenever they came to town, they always pick the snazziest restaurant, and you went for the meal, right? You're like, oh man, is it that time of year? Did you get an invite? Where are we going this year? Ooh, Brazilian Steakhouse, I'm there. It almost reminds me of like the timeshare ones. They're like, hey, everyone knew that was the scene and be seen.
Yeah.
You wanted to be in person. You're like, yes, I made the cut this year. I wrote just enough, of their product to be part of the feedback council or whatever I was part of. So
Yeah.
some of those things that we've relied on in the past to how do you stoke the flames? How do you keep that connectivity, in a world, and how do you make it, it just the word keeps coming to mind, accessible, right? So, we think about accessibility on like an ADA lens. I'm not talking about wheelchair ramps here. I'm talking about how do you, for example, duplicate that in-person meeting that you used to have where you used to give them a nice fancy packet, right? What is the digital equivalent of that packet? Making sure that before we have meetings, that you send out digital copies of everything that you're going to refer to, if they have Zoom capabilities where you can do shared screens, where you still are replicating that across the table feel, that you've been able to do in the past, having, again, some way that you can capture it, even if it's recording it so that anyone who wasn't able to be present can still replay it, and kind of have that same feel as if they were in the room. Because as we continue because that's going to be the other, the elephant in the room is where does proof of vaccination and HIPAA intersect?
Yeah.
Right? Because, a lot of these policies that you're seeing rolling out right now as we're loosening restrictions are based on an honor system. They're saying, oh, fully vaccinated adults are able to do A, B, and C, but we're not allowed to ask you for proof that you're fully vaccinated.
Right.
How does that work with your employees? Are you going to require they be vaccinated? Are you allowed to require that they be vaccinated? So there's so many other things that we also have to keep in mind, that are going to have to. This is uncharted water. This is, going back to the previous statement. There is no going back because there's so many different complications we have to consider now.
Yeah. No, I think that's all valid. The vaccination thing, I mean, consulting with some of the municipal clients that I have, a lot of it was either, well, this is what we have in terms of court cases that have kind of like shown us what happened, or what's the guiding principle. Some of it was executive orders. I mean, it was like a mishmash of everything. And then some of it was just to be determined. Like, we can't even answer that question right now. So we're just going to kind of do what we can do in the meantime in good faith, right? And cross that bridge when we come to it, so to speak. Let's see. Matt also coming in with, I remember giving a survey to assess my feedback. he's fortunate to be in claims and able to work from home. As much as he enjoyed going to the office pre-pandemic, so much has changed. I really don't see how I would be able to go back, even at one time per month, single parent, multiple kids, therapy and things like that, and personal life. I think that's also something that is going to creep in here. You want to be consistent, but at the same time, and I think you touched on it before, there are going to be people now that have. I mean, there were people pre-pandemic that had specialized circumstances, right? They had individual circumstances that meant that you had to kind of like bob and weave and be how should I put it, like pliable, right, in terms
Yes.
of how things are done, right? I think the same thing is going to be true now. There are going to be other people that have things that come up that are going to be germane to whether or not they come back at all, or if they have to come back later than everyone else. And so I think that's going to be just a situation where you have to come at this from a standpoint of not, the iron fist, like we're all coming back on this date and you better be here or you're fired. I think that would end up losing you more than you think it would gain, or that it would, kind of deflect in that process. I think there's a lot of consideration to be had. And Tony coming back with at Jacobson, voluntary return to the office does require showing proof. So at
Interesting.
least in Illinois, it appears that's legal. I think the answer is that the proof of vaccine argument here is it depends on the state.
Hmm.
Now with HIPAA and things like that, I believe the HIPAA requirements are as long as it's kind of like a standard
A
practice, and
blanket.
you
Hmm.
yeah, and you're consistent about it, right? But so that being said, you're also going to have people that even if you are being consistent, they're going to be like, look, I absolutely do not want to give you proof of vaccination. Then the question becomes, all right, can we just keep them remote
Hmm.
and not bring them in, or are we setting ourselves up for a very dangerous precedent? Which by the way opens another. What are the EPL ramifications of making
I
these
was about to
changes?
say, the HR, EPL ramifications are significant
Yeah.
because even, I think to the equivalent of the college campus, right? And
Mm,
so typically for most college students, you have to have proof of certain vaccinations, hepatitis, whatever the case is, but
yeah.
they also have to allow a waiver that says that again you're morally opposed, or for whatever reason you're not going to, and again it's got to go through all the vetting in order to be accepted as kind of a workaround.
Yeah.
um, requesting and requiring proof of a medical disposition, which is really what vaccination is there, it may be a slippery slope, because I saw an ad run the other day, which I thought was fantastic, that I think Uber is donating rides to people who need transportation to vaccination sites.
Hmm.
I've seen where they're, getting a little bit more creative with where vaccines are being made available, whether
Yeah.
it's distribution through your major pharmaceutical, companies, where your pharmacies, rather, like your retailers, the CVS's, Walgreens, and those sort of guys, because they said maybe that's the issue. Maybe it's a convenience thing, that's
Hmm.
causing people not to take advantage of this right now. But yeah, that's a whole other bucket that we've yet to really see how that's going to work,
Yeah.
in terms of not just the employee, but you have to remember, what if they have vulnerable people in their household? So that was one of the rules of thumb, I know, when it came to, for example, unemployment, at least here in the state of Texas, was that if part of the reason you were unable to seek work was because you were caring for somebody who perhaps was infirmed, or you had childcare issues, or there were certain legitimate reasons why that would complicate a particular situation. So there's
Yeah.
so many things that open up. But circling back to the sales implication, I
Hmm.
think about commercial business, right?
Hmm.
Oftentimes when we go on site and we take an application, what we're really doing in that same visit is pre-underwriting. you
Hmm.
know we're making sure that the exposures match what we've been told, right? Is this the building? Does it truly have fencing? Does it truly have, and those sort of things, that we lose a little bit of that ability to really assess risks when we're
Yeah.
not on site. The same thing when it comes to record retention. The question had came up, I know, a couple of months ago, where there was a really spirited debate about how do you really define a principal business location?
It's a good question nowadays, isn't it?
If the building is there, but you're not there, is that still your principal place of business? So if
Yeah.
there were an audit and you're working remotely, but the secured, I mean, I don't think many people move their filing cabinets.
Go to
you know,
Bobby's house. That's where we operated out of. Yeah.
then you have certain areas where there may be some zoning ramifications, right?
Mm,
Because if you've really truly made your residence your home, is that in violation of an HOA?
yeah.
Is that something that's permissible? Do I now have to list that? Do I want it publicly known that, my consultancy is being ran out of my living room?
Yeah.
So when do we go from it was a temporary workaround to, there's deeper, like for example, I've had conversations where they still have to send someone periodically to check the mail.
Yep.
Because there's a drop box, especially in the agency environment. There may be payments in a
Yeah.
lockbox,
Yeah.
and we're still held responsible for when it was received, whether or not there's a physical body there, to receive it. So all of those things are going to have to be addressed. I think a lot of businesses made arrangements with commercial landlords when they initially went, remote.
Mhm.
We've, I think, mentioned it before, the definition of vacancy when it comes to a building, because I think most policy forms say as long as there's, functional utilities, even if there aren't
Mhm.
bodies and seats, as long as it's furnished and as long as, you left the lights on, you're okay. But,
Yeah.
the vacancy rules were also designed around the fact that it would be discovered in a reasonable amount of time should there be a loss.
Yeah.
Really what the bulk of vacancy, was based on. So there's a lot of things that, again, from a sales standpoint, we're going to miss opportunities if we maintain a posture of zero face to face. And so we got to figure out where there's, kind of that cost benefit, you know, what does that look like? And maybe not everyone, and maybe not as often, maybe scaled back or we ramp up. But those are things that are just, again, they're part of the nature of commercial, especially property.
Yeah, and all of that points to there's going to be a lot of moving pieces, and that also means that the education of your sales force is going to have to continue, if not get better, because if you are complacent, you're going to be doing business as if the world existed, 15, 16 months ago versus, what does the regulatory environment look like moving forward, right? So a lot of these things that were executive orders, do they become more permanent and get memorialized in legislation? Do they go away, or is there some level of them remaining that then has to be codified or included in things? The same thing with insurance contracts, like you said, like certain definitions and things like that are going to have to get changed or modified, and that doesn't happen tomorrow, right? Like you don't
Right.
just snap your fingers. I mean, those are things that happen over a process of, a period of time. And again, as much as the states were all kind of unique themselves to begin with, now this adds another level of uniqueness to how the states are operating and how they kind of dictate or how they kind of regulate and oversee things. So a perfect example would be like we were talking about, requiring vaccination, something that's really this applies in New Jersey, and a number of states are like this as well. So you can require vaccination as the employer in order to come back to work. The difference is that if there is any kind of like adverse happening in close time relation to getting that vaccination with the employee, it's now covered under workers' comp, and it's actually a very broad like burden of proof, right? Like the
Mhm.
burden of proof is not really on the employee so much to prove that it's associated with that. It's just kind of this temporal thing, right? So if it
Okay.
happens within a time period, so that aspect of this is also going to be something that evolves over time. For I mean, what does next year look like? Right? Like if reopening is getting people into whatever, hybrid or changed circumstance looks like, what does 2022 look like?
Mhm.
Does the vaccination requirement stand, or at some point can you repeal that, right, and take it back and then make it optional or something? So I think all of those moving parts are going to be extremely they scream for continued education, continued professional development, wink, wink, CPCU courses and things like that, and watching Sell Like a CPCU and How to CPCU. But all of those things are going to be require a very assertive approach to try and make sure that most of your sales and service staff are up to speed with those things.
So
What
here's
did I miss?
another
There's so
thing
much
as
more on
well.
that.
Yeah, with the vaccine, because we're talking about this particular vaccine as if it were like a polio shot, like it was a one and done. We're
Yep.
completely forgetting the fact that they've told us that, there's going to require a booster. I think they said some of these are projecting, I think, like every 6 months or something like that in terms of that cadence. So who monitors that? Whose responsibility is to stay on top of that?
Yeah.
Also, it's a healthy reminder that for those of us, as you're going through your renewal processes with all of your clients, renewing per expiring is probably not something that's going to happen a whole lot right now,
Yeah.
because I guarantee you that there have been some material changes in exposure. Right. So when you're
Yeah.
asking questions like before, if all of the, physical assets were like located in a storage room, what are the chances, if everyone's working from home, that some of that didn't walk out that door and it's not sitting there anymore?
For one reason or another. Yes.
For one
Yeah.
reason or another, right? So, making sure that there's a process to reconcile your assets. We've talked about that in previous shows as well. So now if a storm rolls through, like again here in the lovely Dallas, Texas area, we just had another series of, frightful weather and some, tornado activity again. Regretfully, it hit the same part of town that it hit in 2019. So some of those residents, they literally just got a roof on and moved home, and it came and tore through there again. But I say all that to say that if everything was located at 101 Main Street, you had one location, you had one occurrence when you had a loss.
Yeah.
If you've got 5 employees and they have assets in all 5 homes and all 5 locations had varying degrees of damage, is that one occurrence? Things like that, right? So you start looking at deductibles, you start looking at all these greater implications, that we have to consider. And so we really need to make sure that when we're going through, we're not just taking accord forms and slapping new dates on them, guys, because stuff has changed, and we need to use this as an opportunity to pose some of those questions. What is your business continuity plan? Do you have one in place? Is this required that you have one? Working in office, one thing that I'll definitely say, onboarding and hiring has been a challenge to do remotely for most companies, because without the, some of the ramp up period that we've been able to, you just take for granted, being within earshot of someone else who's on the phone.
Yeah.
With salespeople, that's key, because that's how you continue to evolve your approach. You're like, oh man, I heard him, overcome this obstacle, and I never would have thought to say it that way. When you're in a silo, and you're kind of separated and you don't pick up on some of those, really what we consider to be insignificant, interactions, it long term, just like the impact of the kids that miss so much time from school, we've yet to see what that looks like. It's kind of going to be a bubble.
So you raise a really interesting point. This has some sales ramifications, but it also just has general ramifications in and of itself, right? A lot of us have being moved into more of a digital world. If regardless, if you were hyper digital, you still got more digital during the pandemic, right? And so that's the other thing is, I feel like I'm so spread out over a multitude of different platforms, messaging platforms and things like that. I can only imagine within your company, if you are spread out in terms of at the very least that type of fundamental level of communication, it can still be really daunting. So like, for instance, if you are a Slack company or another company like Monday.com or one of these other ones, right? And you have these chat channels. Well, when someone wakes up at 7 o'clock in the morning and they turn on Slack or they look on their phone and it's like 105 messages, they're like, the hell with that. I'm not going to read 105 messages. I need to get to work, right? And so that's also really difficult, where to have to figure a way that if we are, continuing to have some of these, like what I would call decentralized conversations, or at the very least kind of these dispersed conversations in different places, there's going to have to be some additional ingenuity, I think, that is going to have to creep in here, where we're going to have to find some way, might be, machine learning or AI or something like that, to parse those conversations and take the very important kind of like, meat of them or marrow of them and consolidate them and put them in a very easily digestible place. Because the last thing I want to do, I have it with all, like, even with like my personal conversations with people I know, they'll be like, didn't you see me talk about that 3 days ago? And I was like, dude, there's 1,000 messages in this chat room. Like, I literally didn't see anything you talked about on that subject.
Or even worse, you don't know where you saw it. You saw it, and you're like,
yes,
was that an email? Was that a Slack? Was that a text? Was that a post? Was that... I don't know.
Was an influencer talking about it? Like, I have no idea, right? Like, not to mention the fact that, and I was going to raise this as like a thought. I've been really not involved in what's the chat based app now that Clubhouse, right? So Deidre gave me an invite, and I feel really bad. I wish I could maybe I can give it back to her or something like that. I haven't been really involved in it because, from my understanding, it's mostly like an Apple based kind of thing.
They rolled it out to Android.
Yeah, it is rolling out. The one thing I have been introduced to is the Twitter equivalent to it, and the Twitter equivalent I have found is like extremely seamless. And what's nice is like, I mean, or I guess maybe it's a different nuance where like Clubhouse is invite only, whereas Twitter it's like whoever you're connected to can see it.
And LinkedIn is rolling out something comparable soon too.
Yes, yeah. So that's also something that just kind of sounds like something like that is also going to be cross-applicable to, what we're talking about here, where you could be in the Slack all day long and still feel displaced from people, or you could just be in this open chat room for your company, and, most people can be on mute or whatever, or you can mute it if someone's being loud or talking or something. But if you do want to have that kind of like, water cooler type conversation, it gives you the ability, or at least the feeling of, hearing chatter and people and background noise.
People are going to talk freely if they feel like it's on a monitored line?
It depends. I don't know. Hell, everything you write in Slack and stuff like that is monitored and stuff. So, at the very least on that, I would say the answer is probably no. They're not gonna trash their boss, or at least I don't think they would. But
there's nothing like the moment when someone says something in an open channel that they didn't realize they said in the wrong space.
Yeah,
the moment when you realize all of your employees are conspiring against you, and while they're being really positive on the one that you're on the other one.
Yeah, the forgetfulness of pressing the mute button is the new reply all. Like, that's what it is, right? That's exactly what it is.
Exactly it. That's so spot on. Yeah, because people forget to end call or end meeting, and the camera's still rolling, and the mute. And I remember I was on a call, and it was just the most cringe-worthy. I'm sitting here sending a direct message to the host, like, you can mute all, right? Yeah. I can't hear any more of this conversation without completely. Like, we need to give them some dignity back. Just go ahead and just apply a mute across the board, and let them unmute when they're ready to come back. But yeah, there's so many funny things that you kind of laugh about. The you're on mute. I think that's the new mantra of 2020 and 2021. How many people join a call and their mouth is going, and you're like, no, and you're trying to like discreetly tell them.
Yeah, no, it is. The more things change, the more they stay the same, kind of. It's just like a different, the same issue or the different issue is in the same, execution, that kind of thing. But no, and you know what? In the sales environment, that also applies. I know some companies that use Slack and those types of solutions to also create these dedicated chat channels with clients. And you have to watch out because, if something gets put into the chat channel that then gets communicated to the client, obviously that could be bad, or miscommunicated to the client. Or, again, the client could look at it and be like, y'all have been talking back and forth, amongst yourselves for, 6 hours here, and I have to run a business. I don't have time to read all this word, So yeah, that is, I think that's also the nature of it is, don't assume, right? And I think that was the take home of your piece on, filling out the Accord forms, right? Like that GL form, all of those answers aren't necessarily all no. Like you just don't get to assume that now.
Not anymore.
And so the same thing with all the rest of them, any other thoughts? Any other directions or wild cards we didn't talk about? There's so much to talk about on this topic, by the way.
I'm curious to look back on this in like 6 months' time and see, how accurate we were or if we completely missed the mark. I think right now, we move through life in like dog years. Everything is just, you call it, you think it's going to be one way. So that's my, curiosity moment. Oh, and I'd be remiss if I didn't officially, hold on, let me make sure that, yep, acknowledge a birthday. So, so Terrence Harvey, today is his birthday. So
39th? I think it's 39th, right?
So happy birthday. It was funny. I wished him happy birthday on Facebook. And I think his reply to that is when somebody famous, shouts you out, you print it. So you are officially now part of the episode. So if you're out there watching, happy birthday. Wanted to make that official before we parted ways. But nope, I just think it's still a work in progress, and we're all gonna, be as flexible and adaptable as we can and just make the best decisions with what we have.
Oh yeah, no, most definitely. I think, look, I mean, the rule of thumb throughout this entire thing, and pretty much in life in general, has been, you have to be adaptable. You have to, just find a way to succeed.
Absolutely.
And so that will continue on here into the future. And I don't think that is that's not a very daring Notre Dame-esque conclusion or prognostication. I think it's pretty safe. I'm hedging, So I got one right. I already know I got one right.
So in the spirit of my Southern isms, since Tony Conyers always says that I have them, the old adage that even a clock that's stopped is right twice a day.
That is true. So. Yeah. My brother used to. There was some stand-up comedian who did this bit, who said. Even a broken escalator can become stairs, right? Like,
there you
go. So like, just because it's just because you face some adversity doesn't mean that it's not still useful or anything like that.
Adapt, innovate, man. Yep.
Yeah, but look, that is it. We will be back next Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 o'clock Central with Sell Like a CPCU. And look, drop if you're watching the recorded version. In the comments, drop what your prognostications are, and we'll probably revisit this in 6 months and see what life is like and whether or not we were kind of close to the mark on that one. So, with that, everyone have a good evening. I will be back on How to CPCU in about an hour and a half here, and we're going to be talking loss control interest group. So. Actually, interestingly enough, kind of germane to some of what we were talking about here with the evolving risks that are facing businesses and things like that. So with that, everyone have a good afternoon and evening. Precious, thank you very much. I'll see you next week.
All right. Take care.
Bye.